Hello, welcome to the Bad Vibes Club. This is the 9th of a series of reading group podcasts on sculpture called 10 Texts on Sculpture. In this episode, I speak with Andrea Franchi about 2 texts that help us get to grips with developments in Brazilian art and sculpture in the mid-20th century. First, we look at Ferreira Gullar's foundational Neoconcretist text, Theory of the Non-Object from 1959, and we do that with the help of Michael Asbury's essay from 2005, which is called Neoconcretism And Minimalism on Ferreira Gullar's Theory of the Non-Object. Then we take a closer look at the career of a very famous Brazilian neoconcretist, Lygia Clark, by reading Suely Rolnik's essay, Moulding a Contemporary Soul, The Empty-Full of Lygia Clark from 1999. This gives us an opportunity to really think about a non-Western tradition of modern art and developments that were happening around the same time as minimalism, and lots of stuff that was happening in US and Europe in the late 50s and 60s that we focused on in previous episodes. But it's really also an opportunity to investigate, a different path for the development of sculpture in the 20th century. Gullar's Theory of the Non-Object really is about, it's got connections to Donald Judd's specific objects, and it really is about painting and sculpture coming together to form what would be the new art. And Lygia Clark's career really reflects that, where she starts with painting and really moves off the wall to sculptures, and then, I guess, starts doing things that involve performance and bodies and live events, and relating all that to the political changes in Brazil around that time. One thing I thought I'd do in this intro is just name all the Lygia Clark artworks that we're going to speak about, because they're all worth, Googling and looking up if you've got access to a library. So we speak about bichos, which are these foldable metal artworks. We speak about caminhado, which is the work which involves cutting a Mobius strip with a pair of scissors. Some of these have English translations that are easy to Google. So we look at air and stone, which is a work that involves manipulating a plastic bag full of air with a stone on top. Then we look at some of her later works that involve group work, so Baba Anthropophagica, which means anthropophagic slobber. And we also look at a much later work, Structuring of the Self. And this is when Lygia Clark's, by many definitions, kind of left art, or at least left the art world. But one of the things we think about is what happens if you leave the art world, but you take art with you. And then finally, I thought it was worth mentioning the other Brazilian artist who is kind of easy to find work about in English. Andrea mentioned right at the end of the episode, he just had a big show down at Delavar Pavilion in Bexhill-on-Sea, and he's called Helio Otisika. All right, Andrea does the introduction properly to the text right at the start of the episode, so enjoy this one. It's really interesting, and this is almost the last one. We've got one more to go, so thanks so much for listening. If you listened to all of them, wow, amazing. And yeah, I'll see you at the end. So I might just hand straight over to you and get you to introduce the whole thing, Andrea. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay.
So this is the episode that I had in mind since the beginning, since we did the first episode. It was going to be the last, but we haven't planned for the last. We're still missing one episode. So this might feel a bit of like a closure in some ways. But the idea was to look at Brazilian theory. So I'm Latin American, I'm Peruvian, and I study in Brazil. So I wanted to bring like a different way to think about sculpture, just for us to be aware that actually, the arts are negotiated very differently or defined very differently in different places. And I wanted to have to think about sculpture from like a different perspective. And there was this thing that came up in the first episode about how Brazilian artists deal with the idea of touch, and how they deal with the idea of, the sculpture exists in a different place that is not the gallery, and being distributed and circulated in a different space. So I wanted to bring something to help think about that. So we decided to talk about 2 texts. So one text is Theory of the Non-Object. Is a text by Ferreira Gullar, which was a poet, like a Brazilian poet and a Brazilian critic, and it was published in the newspaper in Rio de Janeiro. And this is why important, because as well, the scene of sculpture that we're talking about is very based on Rio de Janeiro. Different parts of Brazil is huge. Different parts of Brazil have very different traditions of art thinking and practice. And this is a text from 1959. which is really interesting because it, in many ways, has a lot of similarities with like Donald Judd's Specific Object, which I think was written in 62, 63, which is the text that kind of like comes just before minimalism. So it's the moment when like Judd is starting to understand what's happening in the art world and trying to like think about what minimalism is. And they're both very similar in many different ways, and we can talk about it as we go through. And Ferreira Gullar came up with the idea of the non-object because he saw in a sculpture by Lygia Clark, and he didn't know how to classify it as painting or sculpture.
It actually came from Clark. Okay.
So we decided also to read a text about Lygia Clark, which is a text by Suely Rolnik, which is a theorist and a psychologist. She's based in São Paulo, and that's really interesting because she says semiotics a lot of times in her writing, which is a bit like in the UK when someone says Deleuze more than 3 times, you know they went to Goldsmiths. In Brazil, when someone says semiotics more than 3 times, you know they're based at PUC São Paulo.
This is the university in São Paulo.
It's university, it's the University of São Paulo.
Right,
it's just very, very, I love that sort of like. And she was friends with Lygia Clark. She has written a lot about it. She's quite an important and respected scholar in Brazil on arts. And she uses psychoanalysis to look at Lygia Clark. That's kind of like her theoretical area. But it's interesting because it's quite different from the psychoanalytical art readings that we've been reading so far, which are always based on, I would say, an English-speaking tradition. So we've been looking at Melanie Klein, or people read Winnicott, and it all comes from Lacan and kind of like Lacan's importance in the English-speaking world. And Suely Rolnik is really, she kind of like worked with Deleuze and Guattari, and so the way her use of psychoanalytical theory is very, very different from what we read before in like the October magazine people like Rosalind Krauss and Hal Foster and people like that. And that is a much later text. So Suely Rolnik text is in a catalog of a big exhibition of Lygia Clark. So also like circulates in a very different way. And that's was published on 1999.
Okay. Oh, but we should say the theory of the non-object, the text that we actually read and that we'll probably put up it's embedded within, I guess, an introduction and then a critical appreciation of the text by Michael Asbury. So the actual PDF is called Neoconcretism And Minimalism on Ferreira Gullar's theory of the non-object. So who's Michael Asbury? Do you know him?
Yeah, he teaches at Chelsea.
Oh, cool.
He's part of Train. Yeah.
Right.
So he's a Brazilian. I don't even know how he defines himself. Art researcher, I'm going to say. But he writes a lot about this sort of... He's part of this bigger movement of South American curators and art critics and art theorists that are trying to think about this relationship between these kind of like marginal art histories and these kind of like histories that we kind of see as canonical. And so this is part of a book on Cosmopolitan Modernism. So it's a book that is looking at lots of different places in the world and different movements and how they relate with kind of this bigger canon of modernism.
I've just realised normally I edit out all my but I can't do that today because we're in the same room. So just apologies for the way I nod with my mouth. Anyway, right, okay, great. Thanks for that introduction. That's really good. So how do you want to start? Because I guess that Lygia Clark, I think it's really great that we've got like her and her body of work to keep going back to. But do you want to start with Theory of the Non-Object? Because I guess in a way that is a fundamental text.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe we can do that faster. I think, I was going to do like a historical, but maybe like we can do that when we go to Lygia Clark, because it's like a really interesting moment in Brazil. So you're getting like the end of the faith in modernity, and in 64, so this is published in 59, in 64, we have the military coup, and that's really important in the sense of how we think about the body and sculpture and how it circulates and things. So this is a bit before that, when there's still like this hope that everything's up for grabs and there's space for like a revolution in a sense.
To put it in really basic terms, and you can fill in the details here, this text was originally published in a kind of newspaper supplement.
Yeah, it's like The Guardian. It was published in The Guardian magazine.
Yeah, exactly. It's published in The Guardian magazine. And that basically that supplement lasts from 1959 to 1961. So those years being almost this high watermark of this kind of like developing ideas of what Brazilians what Brazil's modernity might look like.
Yeah, and you can see that in music. I guess people might be more familiar with there's lots of really interesting stuff happening in Brazilian music as well, and in other parts of South America. So we all have it's like a wave of dictatorships that come to follow this, and Ferreira Gullar is doing this because he's part of this movement, which is the one that is on the title, which is called Neoconcretism. And I'm just going to give a really short introduction, but Brazil has this first biennial, the São Paulo biennial, which is in the 50s. And as many things in the art world, this biennial is completely funded by the CIA. And the idea is to... It is. I was at uni when the paper... Because it was a rumor and a conspiracy theory. And I was at uni when the papers actually, when they're unsealed. And it was funded by the CIA.
Everything good in the art.
It's funded by the CIA.
Connoisseurs.
So what they do, they're really concerned about, the Soviet Union abstraction. So what they do is they fund all these artists that are doing completely non-political abstract art, which is super interesting. So we have the first prize goes to Max Bill, it's an abstract sculpture. And that is a massive influence in Brazilian abstract art in São Paulo. And then you have this movement that is called the Concretismo. And they are all about numbers and calculations and math. There's all these math justifications
so
about...
that's concretism,
That's
right?
concretism.
For the English translation. Yeah, all right.
And then in Rio, you have these other people, which includes Ferreira Gullar and Lygia Clark, who decided that they're interested in abstraction, but there is interest in abstraction with feeling. That's how I study it in uni. And Ferreira Gullar is part of this group. So this group is just started. It started in 1959, and this text is published in the newspaper in December 1959. And it's kind of trying to map what they're doing. So it started with this really short introduction of what the non-object is. So I'm just going to read that. I find a lot of Brazilian writing really, really hard to get my head around, especially because I think he's a poet and he has this kind of way of talking about things that is not necessarily my way of talking about things.
Yeah.
But the expression non-object does not intend to describe a negative object, nor any other thing that might be opposite to material objects. The non-object is not an anti-object, but a special object, through which a synthesis of sensorial and mental experiences is intended to take place. It is a transparent body in terms of phenomenological knowledge. While being interiorly perceptible, it leaves no trace. It is pure appearance. All true works of art are in fact non-objects. If this denomination is now adopted, it is to enable an emphasis on the problems of current art from a new angle. So what's interesting here in this idea of the non-object as being this transparent object or these negative objects is that is in a way, and Michael Asbury will talk about this and compare with how Foster writing about minimalism. This is very, very similar to the minimalist object in the sense that it is an object that doesn't hold this content or its reason of being in itself, but it only exists because of the relational tensions that it creates. So it is always in relation to the space that it is, in relation to the viewer, in relation to time. But it in itself is not a thing.
Yeah, that's the key thing for me in terms of it's philosophical underpinning, right? It's phenomenology rather than if you were comparing it to the São Paulo concretists who were interested in numbers and logic and rules and stuff, whereas phenomenology, of course, is all about the perception of the person. In this case, I guess it's the viewer. But I thought it was really interesting that then he goes straight into
painting. He goes into painting. Yeah, I make a massive note. Yeah, he goes into painting.
I mean, I was going to say something more kind of basing that he then goes into this historical reasoning as to why this has happened, which I don't think is so foregrounded in some of the minimalist texts that we read. Maybe it is in specific objects. I haven't read that for ages. But yeah, I thought it was really interesting that he basically goes back to Cubism, avant-garde, other kind of avant-garde stuff, and then modernist sculpture and stuff like that. And basically, I mean, maybe I'm jumping, but his main thing, and I'm reducing the thesis here, is that sculpture gets rid of the base and painting gets rid of the frame. And once they do that, and this was the bit that I thought was interesting, paintings that have got rid of the frame and sculpture that has got rid of the base are closer to each other than they are to traditional painting or traditional sculpture. And that was kind of how I understood the non-object. That's really basic because it's just understanding it in terms of art history, but I thought that was useful for me, was like the new art is like this stuff that can't be classified in terms of painting or sculpture. And it's about the reasons how they, two traditions kind of broke free of their constraints.
But to me, it was really interesting because I think you're completely, and I think the specific object by Judd is exactly that as well. It's just a text about, how like sculpture is now using color, like all these two things are blending, and it's really, really hard. Like this, what Judd is saying is that the stuff that is really interesting, yes, is the stuff that is neither one or the other. Is doing both things at the same time. But it's really funny that before we read all this stuff about minimalism and I've become obsessed with minimalism, I didn't realize this other side, which is that at the same time, and I don't know, it's interesting. Like, I don't know if those two things needed to happen at the same time, but it's interesting that they both happen at the same time in Brazil and in the US. That at the same time that these two things, these two categories stop being important and the interesting stuff is the stuff that is in between. At the same time, there's this thing about phenomenology and there's this thing about the object not containing, the theatricality, something that appear in both places, even though it's described in different ways, but it's the same, that without the base and the frame, then the relation between the object and the viewer doesn't have those containers, that the frame and the base were like marking a difference that put it in a different space. And now we're making space together or something like that.
And I think that's the interesting thing, is that a bit like minimalism, the actual historical period of neoconcretism is basically these 3 years, or basically until the dictatorship really kicks in. And that's when people realise maybe it's lacking somewhat in the way it engages with politics. But it does have a politics embedded into it. It's just a very kind of fundamental politics about the relationship between the artwork and the viewer and how the viewer gets brought into that. But and also the other similarity is this notion that it's a reaction against a high point of modernity. In the case of minimalism, kind of Clement Greenberg modernity. And does he keep mentioning Taschism as well?
Yes.
Yeah, so Taschism. I had to Google it. I was like, I know that word, which is like the French word for like European. I don't know the art history of it, but basically what looks like abstract expressionism, but was produced in Europe, which you never hear anyone say that word anymore. It's like
I don't know, but it's also because, like, let's be honest, like the Anglophone world, it completely ignores that contemporary art exists anywhere outside of the UK and the US. See, when I was in uni, I studied like modernism and contemporary art in France, which is something that once I've moved here, never.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
But for us, it's quite like Brazil has a very strong connection with France.
Oh, okay.
We have like a lot of like partnerships and exchanges, and Lygia Clark taught at the Sorbonne, Suely Rolnik studied at the Sorbonne.
Okay.
Like, so it's a very different, but I hadn't heard Taschism since I moved here.
The way, and this is again one of these stories of modern art that maybe it's quite useful that comes from my art education, is that in my mind what happens is you get Paris is the main place, and then the main place moves to New York, and once it moves to New York you can forget about France. You don't have to think about France and New York, but yeah, of course you're right, it's just a bias, isn't it, that is
and then people just pop. It's like, oh, this is, how did like boys suddenly pop up, or how does this
exactly.
other person is like, there's not a scene, there's not anything happening there.
But just to finish that off, so it's a reaction against high modernity, both minimalism and neoconcretism, but they're also almost like, in the end they end up being almost, I think it's described better in Michael Asbury's piece, but it's like the apogee of modernism. It's like, actually, if you look at it in one way, it's like the necessary like
culmination.
That's it. Culmination is the word, of like all those things. So he has this really good thing about sculpture eliminating the figure, and then it eliminates mass, and then it eliminates weight. So all of these stripping away. It's lovely, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, here we go. So this is the line that I thought was nice. From which we can conclude that current painting and sculpture are converging towards a common point, distancing themselves from their origins. They become special objects, non-objects, for which the denominations painting and sculpture perhaps no longer apply. So this final moment, whether it's actually happening or not, of like they shed the previous trappings of art and become this new thing, which is, I guess we would now call contemporary art, but at that point lots of words being floated for it. So it is interesting, this moment, this turning point, which is also the culmination of, and also a rejection of, all of these modernist ideals or something. Yeah, what are your other quotes?
I mean, I was just going to highlight something that you mentioned, which I think is super interesting, which is, this thing that both minimalism and neoconcretism are super short. The transitioning moments, they're so committed. Like, you know, when you read Gullar on this, it's like, yes, it's like you found this thing and it's going to stay forever. And it just lasts like 3 years. And I think minimalism is the same, right? You read like Robert Morris, Notes on Sculpture, and you're like, oh my God, he's so sure this is it. And then 3 years later, he's doing something completely different. He's like, yeah, whatever, that's not. And there's something quite, interesting about the kind of like the radicality of what they're proposing that is not sustainable.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
In a sense that is really... But it is interesting that, you know, then minimalism becomes this... I mean, it's so hard to talk about, I think, US-based art without thinking about minimalism. And I think in Brazil, there's a discussion and a lot of people get really annoyed because there is a discourse that is like, it's really hard to talk about Brazilian art. You know, you can't ignore neoconcretism if you're going to talk about Brazilian art, because it's such a moment that kind of questions so many things and dismantles so many things. And then...
But genealogically, it's doing something which... It does it explicitly, right? When he's talking about the death of painting, he's talking about cubism, how that pulverized the painted picture, and then basically the movement towards abstraction. But he does mention the fact that cubism also has this other stuff, which is relief, collage, words. All this other stuff is in the avant-garde, which has to be dispensed with to make this pure argument, which is why it's kind of a modernist argument about like the teleological development. Because of course, like, again, just to bring this back to something else that has come up a lot for me, is that performing or the body or participation was a big part of lots of avant-garde practices. And they were rediscovered and kind of historicized in quite a weird way. Those things couldn't ever be recuperated into the high modernism of Clement Greenberg. But actually they carried on happening. It's just they weren't the main thing, or they weren't the grand narrative or something. So when Lygia Clark, you know, slowly shifts her work, which, you know, when we speak about the other essay, it's not like the neoconcrete stuff necessarily leads to this other stuff, but that is kind of how it reads in the essay. Like it might be that, like, who are we talking about? Sengen Ngudi looking back at Gutai or something. Like it might be that she read about something happening in the 1930s and that inspired her. You know, like there's these other ways that people grab hold of ideas that are not just like slowly progressing like from what has come before. And I think that's the key thing here as well. It's like the US and Brazil were different places, but they were also like, well, Brazil was presumably like knowing about things that are happening in the US as well. Maybe the US didn't give a fuck what was happening in Brazil. Like it doesn't care what happens anywhere else. But I think, and that does come up in Michael Asbury's stuff, is that like, I can't remember, he has a word for it and I can't find it now. But basically things like pop up, and it might be hard to track the exact reasons why they pop up, but it's important to note that it's, any big narrative that just says this thing followed this thing, which followed this thing, is like necessarily you should be suspicious of, which is what he critiques in Hal Foster's arguments about minimalism.
I mean, I'm 100% with you there. That's what I dislike Rosalind Krauss.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I think to me, what is exciting about these moments is less the sort of the progression and the influence. And I get quite excited about these people getting together. It's like what happened in those moments when a certain group of people just finds this kind of like collective, even if it is energy dispersed. But, you know, even like, you know, we think about Robert Morris, and then you think about Yvonne Rainer, and you think about Donald Judd, and you think about, I don't know, there's like this, I'm going to call it a scene, but there's this moment where all these people have this, share excitement about doing weird stuff. I think that's my favorite thing about art. It's like when you find your people to have the excitement to do weird stuff together that doesn't necessarily have a place in the world at the moment, but you can like create a place through being together. Yeah,
but also just how these places are made being a question of, you know, a materialist question. So obviously maybe you can sketch some other stuff, but here it's so obvious that the fact that the journal invites Gullar and other people write stuff for the journal. You know, they mentioned that poetry becomes really important because they have a place to publish the poetry. So if you've got a friend who can give you like, whatever it is, 100 quid to write an article for a journal, suddenly everyone's writing poems and manifestos and essays and responding to essays and stuff like that. It's like Art Forum, right, from the minimalists, right? They just kept getting to publish stuff so they can respond to each other and review each other and propose things in a published form that is seen by lots of people, but is also really for the scene. Sorry, you know what I mean? Like, is read by lots of people, but is for the scene. So I think that's super interesting. What do you know of? Were there certain galleries or were there certain forums in which discussions were happening. There was something about a salon, right? I feel like the person who Gullar trained under ran a salon in their library or something. Michael Asbury says. I can't find it anyway.
So it's interesting in terms of structures because, again, like we don't have, especially in Brazil at that time, we don't have an art world structure in a sense. So everything's a bit DIY and everything is a bit, so there's lots of things about people in flats, but like, I don't know, like poster art's massive in Brazil and like, self-publishing. So, the people that there's the same fight that is happening in the arts between concrete art and neoconcrete art is happening in poetry. So like São Paulo has this big scene of like, maybe it's Augusto de Campos that you're saying. So Augusto de Campos like is this poet in based in São Paulo, and he's doing this kind of poems. I guess I don't know if it's connected to Lipo in one sense, but it's like, have one word and then you take one letter and the other. They're like these really visual poems, and this fight about what does that do, and then how do you kind of like, again, think about feelings and sensations and other things is also happening. And there's the music scene, but it's all very, I would say that in terms of how it happens in Brazil, a lot of this stuff are just very informal. Like flats are something that appear a lot. So like, same thing with Lygia Clark. She comes back and then she does stuff in her flat for the last part of her life and things like that. So, and I think that's really interesting at the moment. And again, for like students that are teaching, because we're living in a moment where like there's so little resources and support and structures. And it's interesting to see how, some of this, how people like in other moments in time, but in other places, and how kind of like they manage to do the work and still find those structures and material support that they sort of like had to build themselves with very little, but that you still need it. Like you say, you still need something material and structural to support that being together and that thinking together. And if you don't have something like Art Forum, or you don't have something like Jornal do Brasil, like then you sort of have to create those structures. But you can create those structures with very little. You can create those structures with like saying, I'm gonna, let's meet in my flat and read something together. I
guess we're doing it right now.
Yeah, exactly. It's just our collectivity is very small.
It's just me and you. No, I mean, it's been really nice to have a chat with people about this podcast. I mean, it's maybe not, I'm not saying that it's creating a scene, but like, it's a very small thing, isn't it? And we don't rely on...
We don't get paid.
We don't get paid. Yeah, that's the main thing. No one's paying us to do it, and there's no money to put it up on the internet or do whatever. But it's created a conversation for me with lots and lots of people about reading, about text, about sculpture, about how people are learning in contemporary life and how people think about our history. So it's been really useful, and it's a very small thing. I mean, the other thing I think of when I think of like New York in the 60s is lofts, right? So like, is it downtown New York is just like a bit bare and people can get rent really cheap. So is that the same with Sao Paulo? Would it have been a very cheap city to live in? Or is that not even a relevant consideration in Brazil? Is that like not the way that people think about?
I think that's not the way that people think about it. And I also think like there is a middle classness to this scene.
Oh, okay.
That is quite different from here, because here, in a sense, the working class, because the welfare system has had a lot of more support. That support is ending now, or has been taken away. But so our relation to class and how you navigate and who gets to be an artist, that is something that has really just started to change a lot more recently when we start to have like more leftist governments in a sense. But I would say like even in, because you need to have, but in the other sense, you have like really incredibly and sophisticated Brazilian activism that happen in what would be like the similar to the working classes. That is, all the things about participatory democracy that are not about voting budgets, for the love of God, but are like the really, really important and things they're just coming from working class that doesn't have, and I would say to me a lot of the stuff that is interesting to me that I will say that is something like social art practice is happening in those spheres, but it's not being negotiated through an art framework because the art has this different cost of access.
So that is really worth reading, because it's the non-object thing and Asbury's appreciation of it and kind of placement of it, because it's really notable how many similarities there are to texts being written by minimalists around that time, but also these very specific differences about genealogy, like who are the thinkers that they're like grabbing and saying, oh, you know, this is Gestalt phenomenology, like this is why we think this is important, or what are the words? So like autonomous works of art are kind of abandoned by minimalism, but here autonomy is really still an important word, but it's a different kind of autonomy. You're like defining that word differently. Or yeah, just like saying that painting becomes like a really important thing, like how painting becomes three-dimensional or something like that is like central to it, which doesn't seem so important in those minimalist texts.
I thought that was super interesting to me that he starts with painting to something that to me, although the now object is not a sculpture, to me, it kind of like, it actually is, you know, it kind of like, when I think about Eleutisika's practice or Lygia Clark, I think about their practices are sculptural practices.
Yeah.
So to me, the narrative was really interesting, that it comes from painting and then sculpture and then it goes there. It felt like,
and that is borne out actually if we switch over to the other text in those early works by Lygia Clark, which really are like abstract paintings that then become relief paintings that then, I don't know if they step off the wall, that's not quite the right phrase, but then she moves into 3D from painting. So it is a very clear line in her practice. And the way just that Gullar kind of dismisses Duchamp's ready-mades, because it's that transfiguration. His quote is, this process of transfiguration of the object is limited by the fact that it's grounded not so much in the formal qualities of the object, but by its connection to the object's quotidian use. So that is a problem for Gullar in a way that I don't think that's a problem for like the minimalists. Like they would be happy to have Duchamp as like one of their, you know, the people who are around and important to them.
And that was really cool as well, to kind of like stop and think about a history of, or like a context of Brazilian art that doesn't have Duchamp, because Duchamp appears so often in all of our readings, and they are using all these materials that are like everyday materials that have all these different contexts, and to think about them that completely outside of the ready-made.
Okay, so how do you want to start with the next one? So the other one's called Moulding a Contemporary Soul, the Empty-Full of Lygia Clark by Suely Rolnik. What's your first quote?
One of the most interesting aspects of this cartography in this current work is the exile of artistic practice into a specialized domain, which presupposes that a certain plane of the process of subjectivation will be confined to the experience of the artist. The plane is the vibrating body, in which contact with the other, human and not human, mobilizes affects as changing as the variable multiplicity that constitute otherness. And I had that because I thought it was really interesting reading this essay. It just all the time, it made me think about Sarah Ahmed, ideas of stickiness, and then Jane Bennett's vibrant matters, and all these different things about affect theory and thing theory and how we affect. I'm just thinking about, you know, when the text is from 99, it just, again, like it gave me like a similar feeling that this relation between Gullar, Judd, that there's this other parallel where like different places just arrive at like similar ways of thinking about things, sort of like accidental in different places.
Yeah, what's that word? Like synchronicity or something? Oh, I don't know. There's a good word for it. But so this is the only thing I would say about this essay is that the words just kept like tripping me up. Like vibrating body kept tripping me up. What's cartography? What does that mean? And what does that mean here? What does cartography mean?
It's mapping.
Oh, okay. So then what does that mean here? One of the most interesting aspects of this cartography in this current work. So what does that mean here?
I think there is like where cartography is like mapping where this work is situated, and she's exiting. She's like slowly. So Lygia Clark slowly, you know, she starts making painting, and she does that, and she kind of slowly moves out into these other places outside of the art context where things can happen in very different ways.
Right. Okay.
That's how I read it,
that
and
makes
that's
absolute sense. Yeah.
That was interesting to me because we're talking about the touch and things, and me saying, how do you do these things in a degree show? And I think part of this essay is like, well, Lygia Clark couldn't do that in the art world. Like, you have to leave it. Like, you can't have that relationship into the art context.
About doing it as a video. Yeah, okay, that's interesting because later on I was thinking about this. So yeah, so that quote is interesting for multiple reasons, and one is that it harks back to an earlier conversation where I think you asked like something about, why are people? What's the connection between all these kind of touchable materials and the viewer? And I started talking about the relationship between those materials and the artist, and that's exactly what's being talked about here, where a certain experience is confined to the artist, but actually Lygia Clark's career, the thesis here is that it's about trying to hand over that affective state to the viewer. Like, how can we get the viewer to feel the things that in modern art, mostly they're like a feeling that the artist had, like between them and the materials or between them and the world, that is then somehow captured in the art.
And I think it's important to say that feelings here means two things. It means the affects, but it also means the sensations, like the physical, tactile.
Well, that is affect, right? I think that's key. For me recently, I had pushed away the word affect because I've been using the word emotion, because I'm interested in named emotions and how we use those words that name emotions to do things in the world. But affect kind of encompasses that, and it also encompasses like physical sensations, like, yeah, the feeling of something being really loud is an affect, right? Like, oh, that's really loud. You don't have to say it to like feel it. But yeah, those things of touch and tactility and interaction being effective as well. So I think it does cover that as well. So she basically just goes through Lygia Clark's practice, right? Starting with paintings, and she has all these different phases, and I got a bit lost in the stages and phases.
About phases, I just want to point something which I really love, and I thought might be really, I never read about it, and I thought might be really useful for students, which is like this kind of practice of experience that she called the Empty-Full.
Oh yeah, what is that?
Experience of, I was like, I read that and I was like, oh my God, I know exactly what that is.
I read it and was just like, wrote it down to ask a question about it. Okay, go on then.
So I'm just gonna over the quote, and is Clark's crises are neither a secondary nor a picturesque piece of information, nor the object of frivolous curiosity about the artist's private life or her confused personality. They are rather at the very core of her work. It is the experience of that which from early on and until the end of her life she would insistently call the Empty-Full. The experience of the vibrating body at the moment in which the exhaustion of a cartography is processed, when the silent incubation of a new reality of feeling is underway, that incubation being the manifestation of the fullness of life in its power of differentiation. The crises were the living of these passages, which in the artist's subjectivity took place like the volcanic eruptions, as she wrote in one of her manuscripts. So the way I understand that is the moment when you're making things and you're in the peak of like understanding something, you finally got it, you're doing your work, and then suddenly it stops and you're like empty and you can't do anything else, because in a way it's like your body already knows that's done and you've done everything that has to do, and this other thing is just like starting to grow inside you, and you can only get there by emptying this other thing. And it's a brutal feeling of like, what am I doing? It's this massive crisis of what is my work about? I thought it was about this, and I've done it, and it's not about that. And and it can last 2 weeks. It can last like 2 years. And there's something really interesting about she kind of like, and you can see that, I think Rolnik is talking about it, because you can see in Clark's work, it has like these very crucial moments of like emptiness when she's doing stuff. You know, she's so successful in doing that thing, and then she stops and she doesn't do something for quite a long time. And then she comes back and she does something that is quite different to what she was doing. And but I like the idea of like this empty, full, and this kind of like dynamic when you just have to empty yourself from what you have to like push and work through things so that you can empty yourself of them, and then you can slowly let yourself be filled with this other thing. And
the point being here that, I mean, later on they talk about Clark being ill and stuff. So like these seem to be marked by crises in her personal life or in her health or whatever. So the body kind of knowing in advance, which makes sense in terms of her, interest in affect and feeling. So should we talk about a particular work? Should we talk about Bichos actually? Mm-hmm. Bichos, Rolnik says, is kind of the fulfillment of the first phase of Clark's work. Do you want to describe the Bichos?
The Bichos are like this, sort of like smaller. They have the size of objects, basically. They have the size of table objects in a sense. They can move around.
I'm just going to say 30 by 30 centimeters. That looks like roughly what you're gesturing to me for the listeners.
So there's these objects they can manipulate, and she can like plant them with cardboard, and she made them in metal, and they can like take different positions. So the idea is that the viewer goes and moves them around, and kind of they don't have a right position or wrong position, or they just take very different forms, and they kind of like go from that with the folds to a different moment when they kind of like they're more like long stripes, sort of like intention, like shapes intention that kind of like concentrate.
Yeah, there's lots of them, right?
There's lots of them
over
and
3 years,
and they live on the table, which again is like a different. Just going back to Helen Molesworth and that kind of like the history. Like some sculpture leave the pedestal for the floor, but then there's this sculpture that leaves the pedestal for the table, which has a very different relationship with the human body. Again.
Of course. Yeah. And constructivism seems to come up a lot, which again is one of these things where like Krauss dismisses constructivism as like an important predecessor to the work that then happens in the 60s. But constructivism comes up a lot. So
for us, it's basic because that's what the CIA does. Like the whole biennial is about promoting constructivist art that doesn't have, so Malevich
emptied out of the
so Malevich like red painting, instead of being like red dress working woman in the fields, she becomes like red one.
Right. Okay, yeah. So instead of being propaganda for like a certain kind of politics, it becomes pure abstraction or something. Okay, that's interesting. So so it has this connective to the constructivist product, new materials using metal rather than art materials, and they're interactive as well. But then what seems really interesting is that the next work, which is a very famous work, I'm not going to pronounce it right, Caminhando, comes from the making process of Bichos. So do you want to describe that? Because that's a nice...
So Caminhando is a Moebius strip. I don't know if you know this. So you get like a long strip of paper and you turn one side and glue it together. And if you start cutting with a scissor, you kind of like cut this really weird shape where like two circles are interlinked. And what the work is basically giving the paper and the scissors to people for them to do the... So it's interesting as well, because like this is not how art history functions, right? The way Caminhando exists is a photograph of Lygia Clark sitting down and cutting the paper.
Yeah.
But the work itself was the scissor and the...
What I thought was really... Actually, I'm going to read it out because I think it's a really good description. Strips of paper twisted 180 degrees, whose ends are glued together in such a way as to transform them into a Moebius strip. This is page 12. And that's the thing that is made. So that's the object that's made, but the work consists simply in offering to the spectator this object and a pair of scissors, with instructions to choose a point at random to begin their cut and avoid hitting the same spot upon each completion of the circuit. The strip simultaneously narrows and lengthens with each successive cycle until the scissors can no longer avoid the starting point. At this moment, the strip regains its front and back because it's been cut and becomes a strip, and the work is concluded. So it's really, really specific piece of participatory art. This is not like an open, like, here, see what you can do with this paper and scissors. This is like, here is this very specific object and here's a very specific action for you to do. And then it will finish. Once you can no longer do that action, then the work finishes. So, but what's it? Oh yeah, the reason I asked about that is because that was this thing where she made the Bichos out of paper. She cut paper to make the nets that she would then use to like cut the steel for Bichos. I guess she just really liked that process and she thought that was so this thing about the relationship between the material and the artist, how do you transfer that over to the viewer? And this is how, this is one solution, which is like you guide the viewer through a very specific version of the process that you thought was really interesting.
It's interesting. So I put a big note saying it's like when she started talking about Bichos on part 10, which is like, it's really important to me, like to think about touch and this relation between subject and object, but also to avoid, or like I would like to avoid using words like interactivity or participation, because to me, those words, they come from a different tradition.
Right,
and they have like very different ideas about, and this goes back to the touch. And I think like the politics of what Clark's work does and the politics that interest in Brazilian art that I think lack a lot of times in the politics of this type of work here, when you have the participatory work, when you have the thing that is like, you give a piece of paper and a scissor and you can do whatever you want. But it's such a, that is such a different, and I find it incredibly patronizing attitude to the other, in which I think this is a very different relation because of the specificity of those instructions and the result. There's a very different type of sharing there that is not the sharing that participatory art or like interactive art presupposes, where you're still, it's hard to, there's something inscribed there about who is the artist and who is not the artist and what the object's going to be in the end, which I think is exactly the sort of thing that Lygia Clark is trying to dismantle and confused.
Yeah.
Confused, that makes sense. And that will go forward as her work progresses, I think.
I mean, for me, like the thing I think about is how I know it's not performance, but like if I think about this from a performance stance, like how that work is constituted to a secondary audience is very important. So you have the photo and you have descriptions such as this one that pass on the work, right? Many more people have seen this work as a description and a photo than ever did the cutting version of it. So it's how these things constitute the liveness of the work, if we're thinking about it from performance. But what do you think the artwork's focus is on, if it's not, if we try and avoid those words of participation or interactivity? Like, what is it? Do you know how the work was originally experienced? Was it in someone's flat? Was it in a gallery? Was it at an event? Do you know if that's ever mentioned? Because it's not mentioned here.
But
right?
I know people do it all the time. So you will have a thing where like someone would just like set up and be, let's do comiendo. And they'll just like get lots of paper and scissors and they'll
that's interesting.
do it.
Okay, yeah.
So like, I think if you were in Brazil, the chances of you actually experiencing the work are quite high.
Well, the way, again, to think about it from that, so you have the picture, you have the story, and then you have that other thing of people doing it at school or in uni, or like, I read about this thing, or like...
Yeah, there is a method that is
ether.
reproducible.
Yeah, okay.
And that's what's matter, is like the method in itself.
Yeah.
And that's going to happen more and more. So there's lots of people, for example, who still do the latest work, that structuring the self.
Can I read a quote, actually? So This is page 12. I didn't get through the whole essay, so you'll have to guide us through the end. But as Clark wrote, so this is Lygia Clark writing, it's no longer the problem of feeling the poetic through a form. The structure exists there only as a support for the expressive gesture, the cut, and after it is finished, it has nothing to do with the traditional work of art. So you're not getting someone to make a bit of art. It's the state of art without art. Cutting forward a bit. The act makes contemporary man aware that the poetic is not outside him but within him, and that he had always projected it by means of the object called art. And that, to me, that there does something, like it flagged something to me, like a very purist version of what art should do, right? So it reminds me of Peter Osborne's description of hard conceptual art, which is where all art should propose a concept of art. And that was like Joseph Kossuth's idea of what art should now be, now that we've like reached the end of art or whatever. And this seemed like a kind of hard phenomenological art. Like all art should be a way for a person to understand that art is a projection of an interior state. So all art should kind of destroy the object and should become a recognition on the part of the person experiencing it, not viewer, not participant, but like the person, that actually art is inside all of us or something, to put it in a really grim way.
But also so think about this, right? So we're getting to like 63, 64, you have this massive coup, and 65 we have this kind of law that basically anyone could be in prison for any reason without having any recourse to get out of jail.
Yeah, can you be a bit more specific? Because I read like this law comes in, but it just didn't really tell me what. So what is the law and why is it? Is there a reason it's brought?
So it's a bit like terrorist law in a sense.
Yeah,
it's a law that anyone can, if you're considered like an enemy of the state, if there's suspicion, then the police can arrest you and they can keep you for as long as
intellectuals,
as long as
artists, anyone.
Yeah, and anyone. So when I went to university, for example, my university is still in the regulations. You're not allowed to have more than 3 people talking together at the same time, because during the dictatorship, you couldn't have more than 3 people in public talking together, because that would seen as that you were planning something.
Oh, right. Okay. So what happens to Clark? Does she kind of...
So she goes in exile. So lots of people leave, and she goes to... and she actually has a quite successful London career in a sense. She has she has a gallery in London. But I think what's interesting to me, again, in how this history proceeds in Brazil, and that sense of like it's in you and it's in your body, is like once you have the dictatorship, your body is basically all that you own. Like so many art practices then go and are focused on that relation of the body and the spectator with the body. Because if you think about it, you're coming out from this like massive wave of abstraction that was promoted by the CIA, who supported the coup. Art, in that sense, is completely implicated in kind of like the political horrors, and dictatorship in Brazil is incredibly horrible, and there's a lot of torture and a lot of like... So this idea that you make this artwork that, you make it with your body, and then there's a method and anyone can make at any time an experience on their own. Like, this is why I think, to me, for example, participatory doesn't fulfill what is happening there, because what is participatory in a country where no more than 3 people could be together at the same time without being accused of something? You know what I mean? Like that there's different relationships of how things circulate and what is possible and where your sovereignty ends. Like that are very specific.
So what's another work maybe is the stone and the plastic.
Yeah.
Pedro A.R., Stone and Air. So this comes from a crisis, right? So this is around 1966 or something. So she was in a car accident in the midst of a great crisis, and she was given a plastic bag sealed with a rubber band that she'd been advised to have put around her wrist. So basically like a very soft support for her wrist. And she realised that, it felt nice, I guess, to like play with it. So the work consists of a common plastic bag filled with air and sealed with an ordinary rubber band, on one of whose ends, pointing upward, was placed a pebble. And there are lovely photos of this as well, right? So this is constituted really beautifully through the documentation of it. The accompanying instructions were to hold the bag in the palm of one's hand, pressing it with systolic and diastolic movements. I think that's maybe too much. Do you know what I mean? You don't need to use the words systolic and diastolic. Anyway, basically you press it with your hand to make the pebble rise and fall like the inhalation, exhalation, motions of the life pulse. This is sometimes this essay like through me. I'd be like, okay, yeah, so I'd just say breathing there instead of life pulse, but sure.
That's what I mean. That I do find I'm not used to reading Brazilian text anymore, and I think that is very common. There's like this really poetical, lyrical way of talking about things.
Yeah, to me that work is so great because it's so specific in terms of materials, but also is, implies the idea that anyone could make it. Now, actually, you kind of need the right kind of plastic bag. You probably need a stone of the right size. I don't know, like there's like loads of constraints and that I think are actually about like what the artist does there. But the idea of it being this very like quick work to make or something that we could make it right now and it would work. Yeah, and then there's this line that I think is really key. It takes us back to our first episode. Participation by the spectator took on a new dimension. The work began to move from the act to the sensation that it evoked in the one who touched it. And that's getting close to some of the stuff we were talking about in the first episode about sometimes with conversations with students, it feels like the thing that they want is a feeling in the body of the viewer, which is very hard to do in a gallery setting. And maybe that's the conclusion, well, not conclusion, is one answer to that question. It's like, if you want to work directly with people's feelings, you might have to have a different relationship than the gallery show. Because, yeah, you can't just put a sofa in front of a painting and make people experience calm or something.
But I think it's also interesting because it goes back to, I think on the first episode, just like re-listening, it again is really interesting because we both have a very different, because we didn't properly plan it together, or like that was part of the idea to disagree, that we had very different ideas of what the touch was supposed to mean. And the touch that is meant to produce this, this is why we went to discussion with affect, that this touch that produces this feeling in that first episode, a lot of times it's like, oh, that means that you can like work with a specific set of materials or something that gives you that feeling without having to have the sensation of the touch.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Which to me, the whole point of the touch was the touching. And I think that's really important for Clark as well. Like she's never producing something that is like, like the exhibition that you have of the Hepworth Gallery at the moment, that is like things that are supposed to feel as if you were touching it with your eyes. But this is not the thing. She wants you to have the feeling of touching the things, and the touching those things will produce that feeling. And I think that's the thing that I'm really interested in. And I still think it's something that makes total sense that happens after COVID, when we were not allowed to touch things and we were not allowed to touch each other. And we're still sort of like rediscovering touch. There's this thing, and there's this interest in clay and ceramics. And there's this thing when you meet people that you haven't seen since before COVID and you still don't know if you can't touch them and hug them, or if not, or something. So there's something about our relationship with touch that has changed, and that and to have these artists that are interested in that similar relation that Clark has, which is like, I want people to touch and engage with this thing. And then you're right, like how can you do that in a gallery setting? I don't know.
But also just on the kind of other side of that, affect is an important word here because it does encompass emotion and sensation, right? So I mean, perhaps there is a particular experience that she is trying to get to through the sensation of touch, but also that you if you pass over that plastic bag and the pebble, they will have that experience of touching, like the person touching that will have touched it. So that feeling is passed over, even if perhaps your particular emotional interpretation of that feeling as like calming or somehow evocative of something else is not passed over. The sensation, the kind of lower level affect stuff of like body, touch, like the feeling of plastic bag and air, Like that is passed over. So there is a kind of directness there on a more fundamental level. And maybe it's only once we get to like, yeah, and then I want them to feel calm, or then I want them to feel like scared. Like that's when it gets really hard, because you can't have power over someone else's emotions like that. But you probably can if you're willing to sit in the gallery for like every day of your degree show or whatever, and every 3 hours when someone walks past you go, do you want to hold this plastic bag? But it has to be that cringe. If you know, to like use a modern term, it can't be that you put the plastic bag and people know exactly what to do with it. Like they won't walk in and see the plastic bag and immediately go up to it and start playing with it. You have to have someone be like, do you want to hold this plastic bag and put this pebble in the top? And then you kind of make it breathe. And isn't that nice? Like when you make it breathe, like I thought that was really nice when I did it, which is not a common gallery experience, is it? Like someone just telling you what to do and then you doing it and you being like, oh yeah, that is interesting.
But I think, because you say you didn't finish the essay, but I think it's interesting. So I don't know how much you read into like what her work becomes after that. But what happens is she moves to Paris and she gets a job teaching at Sorbonne, and then she started doing these experiments there, which are really cool with students. So she starts paying attention to what you're saying, to like how do you kind of have those conversations, how you can like create these things together. And I love those works. She has this work that is called like the Baba Anthropophagica, so it's cannibalist saliva, where like students just put this thread in their mouth, and then they took it and they put it in slowly, thread by thread, and they really cover like the body of a student that is on the floor. But also, whenever I show it to my students, I feel like very Latin American, because they all go like, ugh.
I mean, the translation is anthropophagic slobber, which is a good word. It's not just like spit, it's like slobber.
I love that word, but also I love that that's where the work is then, that they were complete, and it goes again to material structures, right? It's a bit like us. We have a salary as teacher. So I have a salary as teacher. You have like a precarious salary as teacher. And then your artwork doesn't depend in the art world anymore. Like suddenly, you can kind of like use that to do weird things like this podcast. So, but it is an example of like, you can't make that work, but then yes, that work sort of does not. And I think it goes back to that first thing about the cartographers, the thing that work maybe just can't exist. Like if you take that work seriously, it can't exist in the structures of the art as they are now. Because it needs like, I'm into social practice, so I think about the Sorbonne thing, and I'm like, oh my God, because it just means that you have your students just not doing stuff, but thinking with you about that stuff all the time, and you spend like a year with them, and you can like develop a language together, and you have an intimacy with them, and they have an intimacy with each other, and you need all those things. You can't just like drop in a biennial and make people do that.
Yeah, see, that seems really key. I did get to that. I got to page 18 where she... I wrote here, the works become more like workshops, and then I got a quote. Clark created 2 new formulas to realise her project of reconnecting life and art in the spectator's subjectivity. The statements that the participants made at the end of the session. So at the end of that work, they will talk about the work. It's not like the work ends and then she's like, yeah, do you get it? Do you get it? It's like they all talk about like, oh yeah, it was really disgusting, but then actually it was really nice that everyone else, or whatever, And then the regularity of the sessions, which took place twice a week, 3 hours a session. So you have this realization there that, it's not a one-off experience for like a disparate group of people. It's like it's about trust. It's about the same group of people meeting over time, which is a totally different understanding of what participatory, sorry to use that word again, but participatory work should be, which, lots of contemporary art, participatory art is something you walk in off the street and just do and then leave again.
Or do a workshop. Even the fact that you kind of call it a workship. See, I hate the word workshop. I don't do workshops because workshop for me is the same, like you said about participatory art. It has the same, it's like you have to say, it is a workshop, but it's not a workshop, right? Okay. Because a workshop is this thing when you can like, you drop down in a group of like 10 people who don't know each other, they don't know you. You do this thing for 2 hours, it's transformative, and then you leave. And that to me, the politics of that in itself is so horrible. Because there's something about like consumerism and entertainment. There's something, I don't know if it comes in this text, or I read a few other Suely Rolnik texts to find one that makes sense for us to read together. But, the thing she talks a lot about is that how Lygia Clark all the time talks about how she hates the idea of art as entertainment, like the idea that the art is this thing that you go and you have like fun for like, or like, you produce it like, and I think, the fact that, yes, that have the regularity and have the discussion. And the discussion is not an evaluation or a thing. It's actually an intellectual discussion that you carry over time, and then things can happen. And I think it goes back to why in my work I'm interested in pedagogy and radical pedagogy, because that time and that space and that learning together is embedded on what that is, in a way that here, whenever you say workshop or participatory art, you're immediately not having that. You have a very different way of thinking about what those moments are supposed to be doing.
We should finish soon, but is there a final work that would be useful to talk about, which I won't have read about, because that's as far as I got, these Sorbonne workshops that she was doing.
So I think we should go to the last one work that she said, which is called Structuring of the Self. And it's really weird. When I went to uni, people did not even talk about it, art at all. It was very this is 99. This is very kind of radical in a sense to propose that as work. The way my teachers at uni will talk about Lygia Clark is that she comes back to the Sorbonne, she leaves art.
Yes.
She abandons art and she becomes a psychoanalyst.
I kept Googling her work and this MoMA thing kept coming up, which is called, and I'll have to look at it, but The Abandonment of Art, Lygia Clark, blah, blah, blah. So it's talking about as though she exited art by doing these works. Yeah. Okay.
So I think this still will say that she exited art, but in a way she took art with her where she exited or something. But what she did was and you can watch videos of it online, but she did these sessions that are not exactly, there's something in between therapy and art, which are super interesting. So she gets so you go there and you lay down and she'll have these objects that she has made, things like the plastic bag with air and the rock, and then she'll pass them and you'll be talking to you. And she's quite influenced. So again, at this point, she had met Deleuze and Guattari, and they're quite influential in Brazil. So there's a whole radical psychoanalytical current in Brazil. There's lots of really interesting things
when
happening.
was this? Sorry.
This is 70s.
70s, okay.
Mid 70s. And she trains other people to do it. So there's still 2 people in a psychiatric hospital in Brazil that do this. They have written about it. Again, so it's not personified. It's it's worth reading the essay because, again, the person who's writing the essay is someone who is in psychoanalysis that has this connection between Deleuze and Guattari with Clark. And Clark basically asked her to do her PhD looking at this work because it's such a weird work that she didn't know where to place. There's lots of really interesting stuff. Again, if anyone is interested in trauma, so what she says is what happens with the work she did at the Sorbonne is that she realized that there was all this stuff that was coming up in those sessions that then needed to be dealt with in some form or the other. And this is how she kind of started doing this individual assessment. But she just, I think what I love about it is that she ended up doing this really weird thing, which is, to me, is clearly art, but it's also clear not art. And kind of she chooses to place it in the world in this completely different way, and has this kind of really interesting relation to people's bodies and touch and experience. And it exists in this one-to-one. I know there's one short documentary when she talks about it, but I don't think there's even documentation of the sessions themselves. So what she did for this show is she collected something 64 videos of people that were her patients to describe what those sessions were like. And then I just read she has this kind of Suely Rolnik and this thing when she said, we're still too modern. We're still too modern for Lygia Clark, which I think is really lovely. That we're still stuck in ideas of modernity that don't allow us to kind of
I really feel that's true for me. I really feel as much as I'm really interested in embarrassment and awkwardness and those things being facilitated and happening in a live environment through performance and other kinds of work. Yeah, I really don't want someone to make me lay down and then put plastic bags on me in a fundamental way that's not about I don't want that to happen to me, but just more I don't want that to happen in the art world that I exist in. And I think it is something to do with artwork should have a kind of barrier that is that still has a viewer, that still has something that, I don't know, that's really
but
interesting.
That's the thing, she doesn't have a viewer,
she doesn't,
right?
That's what I mean. Because again, I keep thinking about this performance, this Philip Auslander essay, the performativity of performance documentation, and how almost all performance has been seen more by the secondary audience than it has by the primary audience. But Lygia Clark is essentially always trying to get rid of that secondary audience, even though it's constituted through maybe the documentation of the people speaking about their experiences of it.
But that's like 20 years later, right?
Yeah,
That's
okay,
like,
yeah.
That's like after she died.
So if it's only constituted through the method and is dispersed, then it really does like challenge notions of like authorship and view, like what the viewer is, and the subject and the object of that piece are kind of get confused and stuff like that. So it really does challenge notions that are in essence still quite like high modern notions of what an artwork is and what a viewer is. So yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
And I love it because I don't know if this is essay. So her writing is translated by different people, so different people use different terms. But there's one of the essays that I read that I keep using institutional critique, and I really hate it because I think that's absolutely not.
Oh yeah, that was in the other essay you passed. Yeah.
And there's something about like not that work is not happening to make a point and to change the art world.
Yeah.
And to, you know what I mean? It's not like she's like emptying the Tate and then one person can go in every hour slot and she do it there. She's like literally just like doing this stuff in her flat. Yeah. And like, you know, charging people a little bit of money for sessions as you would like therapy.
Yeah.
And then doing that with them or something like that. There's and I think that's the abandonment of the art. But I kind of really love the idea that she abandoned art, but she kind of like took art with her to this other.
Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it? Because it's only a bit of a shift. And then suddenly you just aren't constrained by the rules of the gallery or the rules of the art world or the rules of the field of art in general. Like, you just don't call it art. You can charge people. If you don't call it art, you can guide people through the whole session. You don't have to like leave them with this like, if you don't call it art, it doesn't have to be a workshop. Like all of these things just kind of fall away.
And I think it's interesting. I don't know if in this essay, but Suely Rolnik keeps saying like, she keep like saying it's not art, and then she's saying, oh, it is art. No, it is not. Like that, like in different interviews, she will like frame it. Different, which I also really like because there is this tension of being and not being.
Oh, it's great to read this stuff. It's like it just makes you think I'm going to look at her work more. And
her work is incredible. I recommend everyone to look at her work. I mean, and Annotating as well. Like his work is, and lots of other Brazilian artists, but for a lot of Brazilian artists, it's really hard to find stuff. But because Lygia Clark and Annotating had galleries in London, they have loads of like international collectors. Then there's so much stuff published.
Thanks to Andrea and thanks to you for listening. And we will see you for the last episode in 10 Texts on Sculpture next time.